Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. This is the 10th Lyceum debate. The proposition will be, is anarcho-capitalism an ideal toward which we should aspire? And we give the first 10-minute session to Swithun. Your time begins now.
Okay, so what I'm going to tell you is what anarcho-capitalism is. Secondly, why it's good, and thirdly, how it could work. So, firstly, what is anarcho-capitalism? So, firstly, the principle that the first user of a natural resource is the presumptive owner of the resource in all cases. This ownership then extends to voluntary exchanges stemming from the original appropriation. This is held consistently and therefore precludes any form of taxation. Sort of the anarcho bit, rather than the capitalism bit, would be the following two propositions: that there would be legally free entry into the market for arbitration between disputants, and thirdly, legally free entry into the market for security. To note here, by legally free, what I mean is at minimum that the existence of another firm which follows the same rules and processes, etc., as other firms in the market would not be kicked out of the market just by being another firm. You can just enter as another firm in the market for both security and arbitration. Just to note, such a system would yield a very different economy than the one we see at present. Please don't anyone listening think that anarcho-capitalism is the current economy basically just run by mega corporations, because they're largely mega corporations because of central banking, special privileges, historic land grabs, etc., etc. Now, we can debate that, but just this idea that it's not necessarily just going to be what the economy is today, but without the state. So, secondly, why would anarcho-capitalism be a good thing? So, firstly, for humans to flourish, they need natural and external resources, otherwise they die. And these resources are best held privately, as the individuals and families have skin in the game, and on average know their interests better than any external organization. Also, if you didn't take the first user principle, which I outlined earlier, no resources would ever be used, and so everyone would starve and die. So we've got these resources, and why is that? So they know their interests better than everyone else. So what can they do? Mutually agreed action, voluntary exchange will contribute to increasing living standards. They'll know how to use resources better on average than anybody else or any external body, and will be able to use it to improve their lot. When it comes to more commercial aspects, if you invest in a particular area and consumers don't like that and they won't voluntarily exchange their resources with you, you will suffer losses. But on the other hand, if you provide things that people want, you'll be rewarded with profit. So you have the incentive to provide consumers what they want. This is in contrast to a situation of taxation, which reduces the incentive to originally appropriate any resource because the costs have increased but the benefits haven't. And also it reduces the incentive to put to profitable use because the profits are taxed. And so overall, taxation will make the society much poorer, and the anarcho-capitalist society would be significantly richer. And I would also add that since me stealing your car is immoral, it doesn't make a difference if it happens to be the state that does so. So why else is anarcho-capitalism good? So legally free entry into the market for arbitration and security means that people can get services that best suit their needs. Under the current status system, we have government courts and police, and I think pretty much a lot of people agree that the police just do not do what consumers would want them to do if they paid them to do it. They don't attempt, in most cases, to prevent crime. they merely go after the fact. Most of the property crimes are ignored, and they're grossly inefficient. Unlike a situation where the people in question could just buy the services that they wanted, certain sort of patrols outside their house or investigative services when things have been stolen, and the police would be, well, the security agency would be much more responsive to what people actually desire them to do. And similarly with the market for arbitration, with judges, people will be able to find a judge mutually agreeable. I'll explain how this might work in a second. And it would be set up to meet the needs of the victims. And so in this situation, they probably receive restitution for crimes, unlike in the current system, where the government sees crimes against them rather than an individual and just imprisons the criminal, who is kept alive by the taxes of the victim. So not too good on that front either. So thirdly, how could an anarcho-capitalist system work? I suppose this is where most of the dispute would be, I imagine. So firstly, to note here is that there are loads of private security firms that already exist. They run shopping malls, they work for large corporations to provide security, events. This is a growing industry. So we have at least some localized examples of private security existing. The American military does use some private defense contractors as well, although not really defense, I suppose, and really then sort of a quasi-state body. They nevertheless exist and not a full state organization. And also, there are many private arbitrators which exist, particularly in commercial disputes where the current courts are very slow and expensive and they want speedy resolution. Further, private legal arrangements exist on university campuses with homeowner associations, have their own rules and processes. And so this sort of private arbitration isn't something I'm picking from the sky. We have actual current practices which are similar to how it could theoretically work. And further, before I get to the actual thing, there are choice arbitrators. So for example, you weren't just given the state guide. If I have a dispute between somebody else, we have two options. We can fight, or we can find mediation or potentially arbitration. Yeah, we could fight, but fighting is expensive and the outcome is unpredictable. So in many cases, we'll probably choose to either find a mediator, and if we can't, we'll find an arbitrator. So you find a judge who will arbitrate between the two, and then you agree to abide by the decision. It's possible that one person wouldn't agree to abide by any of the judges, which is possible. In such a case, I'd imagine that you go to a recognized judge and possibly be tried in absentia, and then the judgment ruled thereafter. In most cases, I would imagine that people would sign up to particular agencies, which would have pre-existing contracts with each other. So if I was with sort of Rothbard Inc. and you were with Friedman Inc., if we have a dispute between two different agencies, they probably had a prior agreement on a third-party arbitrator. So this would be the general way that it could work. What I would add is that it would work best in a situation where you have a population that has broad general agreement on moral principles, because otherwise you get intractable disagreements on things. So, for example, if you had a large conservative population with Sharia law views on women, or some Africans on female circumcision, etc., those kind of things could be somewhat intractable. So, anarcho-capitalism is likely to work best into a situation of in an area that's broadly ethnically and culturally homogenous for this reason. So you're unlikely to get intractable disputes of this sort. And then, based on the moral principles, which I imagine would be best promulgated by religious scholars, so in the West would have been traditionally the church, and then they would be able to go to the different arbitrators who would compete, and if they were good at what they did, they get business. If they didn't, they go out of business, and then they would provide
Okay, Swithun,
render
your
a service
time
to
is
which is
now up. So now the second opening statement goes to Ruminations. Your time begins now.
Okay. My general argument against anarcho-capitalism does not deal with the internal mechanism of a free property society. In fact, I believe that many of the claims that Swithun just made are indeed correct about the veracity of or plausibility of private courts, which, as he noted, did exist in the medieval period and indeed exist in the present. My primary and first objection to anarcho-capitalism is that it fails to address the existence of the state as such. That is to say that it is an arrangement which exists with the presumption, practically speaking, that indeed there will be other adjacent anarcho-capitalist communities which will not pose a threat to the state of anarchy. This is implausible given that the natural condition of man seems to be something that in Rothbardian terms would constitute a state. Not necessarily a state in the modern sense of the word, but a state in the sense of some kind of coercive monopoly. A hypothetical presence, a hypothetical occurrence of anarchy exists every time a state falls, in a revolution, for example. But it is almost invariably replaced by a more severe iteration of the state, not only demonstrating that the state is indeed the default status of man, but that indeed any attempt to eliminate the state is likely to yield the presence of an even less bearable state. Now, this is something that even on a microcosmic level is seen in the actual policies that an anarcho-capitalist might advocate. For example, there are other states that impose tariffs. Imposition of tariffs, say by the Chinese, for example, is in fact a violation of the non-aggression principle. Yet the anarcho-capitalists, because they disbelieve, and I think this is well nigh universal for anarcho-capitalists, they oppose the use of retaliationary tariffs against such measures on the part of foreign entities. Why is this something that is not in keeping with the non-aggression principle? Well, quite simply because it is failing to address the coercive measures taken on behalf of other states, because this presumption of a commensurate stateless existence on the part of other adjacent societies is something that is, I think, intuitively acted on by anarcho-capitalists. They would say, in my experience, that the reason you cannot have retaliationary tariffs is because you would be punishing the citizens within your own nation. Yet, when a man is placed in prison because of an aggressive act, he is cut off from the rest of society. And in fact, innocent citizens are told they cannot interact with him. Is that a violation of the non-aggression principle? I believe not. In this sense that I suppose the existence, the presumption of this possibility of statelessness is something that in this instance is leading to the failure to address the state with counteractive measures by other comparatively innocent states. In a rather different vein, I would argue that the modern state, that is the nation state that grew out of northwestern Europe beginning in the late medieval period and continuing down to the present, which is currently in jeopardy, is in fact the only society that is commensurate with individualism. I believe that the individual pursuit of truth is a priori the highest value of man. I believe that contemplation and the self-actualization of one's own inner perspective is, as Aristotle identified it, the activity of the gods and therefore the highest end of man. This individualist ethic, and indeed even the aspiration of freedom of speech, is something that has only come into fruition with the rise of the modern state. This does not mean that the modern state is really a reliable trustee of this right, but it is the closest approximation of some kind of guarantor of these rights. Indeed, as the nation-state system comes to falter, we find restrictions on freedom of expression to be intensifying in the name of ever more centralized iterations of hate speech laws and so forth. Now, there is a reason, I think, that the state is necessary, that the nation state is necessary for this degree of individualism, because it, A, has a factor of the commons. That is, even if only for psychological purposes, there must be a common place where people can stand and hold up a sign. Even if this is not conducive to getting their message across, this is necessary in order to provide the psychology of sufficient intellectual atomization. That's right, the state needs to be there in order to atomize people from traditional structures in the form of this common citizenism. By contrast, the libertarians, by and large paleo-libertarians, often admit that indeed their private property structures may be needed to curtail certain excesses of freedom of speech. In general, I think it's a common paleo-libertarian position. For example, very strong among Hoppian libertarians, that indeed ideas such as communism or democracy would be limited. This is incompatible with the notion that we arrive at truth through a gradual process of point and counterpoint, as John Stuart Mill identified it. And this is something that, for the reasons I mentioned, I think only really manifests itself in terms of modern liberal capitalist nation states. It does not manifest itself in traditional pre-nation state societies. And I believe that in the paleo-libertarian affection for pre-classical liberal pre-nation state societies, that you see the same hostility towards intellectual anarchy, which in my estimation is the only kind of anarchy that really matters or is really necessary, precisely because it involves the pursuit of truth as such. The state needs to be there because it needs to be there to apply people with the common identification with the citizenism in such a way as is able to detach them from more organic expressions of authoritarian prejudice and the like. Finally, I will say that the state is the only body in which we've seen any kind of approximation of what we would consider an approximation of classical liberal common legalistic ethic. My final question would be, what society is the least likely to persecute Socrates? Doesn't matter if Socrates is Richard Spencer, or if Socrates is Karl Marx, or if Socrates is myself. The point is, which society is the most tolerant of dissidents compared to other societies? I have no reason to believe that you are going to find such a society expressed in the full actualization, manifestation of the anarcho-capitalist vision. And with that, I will yield the rest of my time.
Okay, thank you for your thoughts, right, Ruminations. All right, Swithun Dobson, your 5-minute rebuttal begins now.
Okay. Firstly, with the point about human nature, I would like to hear more as to why you think human nature requires a coercive monopoly of some description. I simply don't see that as necessary. I see the need for common legal principles and agreed on norms, and also the necessary hierarchies associated with families, etc. But I simply don't see the need for the state as such. I wasn't entirely clear on the point you were making about tariffs, so if you could elaborate on that later, that would be good. I would agree with you with respect to removing a state. A lot of the times when you do try to remove a state as such, it can make things worse, although I think that's more of the process by which you can do it. So, for example, the American Revolution, when it seceded from the British Empire, that was essentially creating another state, you could argue, but it was certainly a lot smaller, and that at least initially didn't have hugely deleterious effects. With your historical point with respect to individualism rose with the state, well, I think historically they do rise at a similar time period, but the question is, does the state cause this? And I suppose that's really where the debate would really be, because it's associated with other forms of developments in philosophy, etc., etc. With respect to private property and the freedom of speech, as you brought up, Hopper is famous for sort of like wanting banning communism in his covenant communities. I think this depends upon the exact form of anarcho-capitalism is formed. I myself wouldn't advocate for the same sort of property position that Hopper does, which is effectively that every landowner is his own mini state, essentially. Not that he's a coercive monopolist, but basically he can decide on whatever.
Okay, I think we lost you, Swithun.
Am I still here? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back.
Oh, sorry. Okay, internet. So you have things develop like, which Hopper does recognize in certain of his writings, the growth of easements and certain pre-existing usage rights, etc., which would make the rights of a sort of a single landowner sort of constrained in certain respects. And I would also agree with you that the pursuit of truth is the major goal of human existence. The question is how to order society to do so. And I think that, at least as we see now with the state in certain forms, the state has been one of the biggest repressors of freedom of speech and general thought that has really existed. I mean, the obvious examples being the communist regimes, National Socialist Germany to some extent. So I simply don't see that the state is a necessary good guarantor of free speech in any way, shape, or form. Clearly, situation in a chance of repression of freedom of speech. Over to you, Todd.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Right, Ruminations, your time begins for your 5-minute rebuttal now.
Okay, so what I would say is that my position is not that the state is in that the state is within the nature of man as some essential laudable quality, rather that it is a natural given, and therefore one must always prepare for that reality, and that may require a kind of perpetual retaliationary position or implementation of the state. So the state is not an ought, but rather it is a given is. And for that reason, there must be states which exist for counteractive purposes. With respect to the tariffs, what I was saying is that the anarcho-capitalist position, which is in opposition to tariffs, is an expression of this anarcho-capitalist failure to take the existence of the state into account. That is, if China levies tariffs against the US, and that's a violation of the non-aggression principle, then the failure of the domestic state to retaliate with its own tariffs is something which would be necessary for a possible redress against abuses by another state. And so in this sense, the example of tariffs is important because I think it's an example of the libertarian failure to accept the existence of other states in action. With respect to the individual and the state and the causes, I think that it's no coincidence that the nation state rose simultaneously or commensurately with individualism, because I think we can see the mechanism by which that took place in the early modern period and after that. That mechanism is one of detachment from traditional family hierarchies, from traditional noble ties, from warring houses and various lineages and things of this nature. And it kind of assigned everyone some kind of number, as it were. I mean, hypothetically, not a literal number, but it united them to something more abstract in such a way as it had a civilizing effect. That is, it took people out of a mindset whereby they're loyal to a specific house, but rather they're, say, loyal to the law. They're loyal to the structure of the state. And in this sense, my position is rather that while I agree with much of what Swithun has said about the things the state should not do, I believe that about 90% of what the state is doing it should not be doing. And as strange as it may sound, I think that the primary job of the state is to be the state. It's to negate the existence of what society looked like before it was the state. I think it's for this reason that reactionaries are often opposed to the nation state, because they want to return to the kind of feudal intimacy of pre-state societies. And I see this sentiment suspiciously present in the advocacy of right libertarians. So in other words, if you really, on a more fundamental level, pit liberalism against reaction, I believe that the state is a necessary vehicle for liberalism. And you can see evidence for this not only in the growth of individualism commensurate with the state, but also the growth, I suppose, of reactionary thought among the most radical anarcho-capitalists. So it's that I take the claims of reaction in paleo-libertarianism seriously. The state is not a worthwhile trustee or a reliable trustee of individualism, except comparatively. That is, empirically, there is no trustee of liberalism or individualism compared to other states. And in fact, as we've seen the decline of the nation state, as I mentioned, not only has individualism risen with the nation state, but I believe that we can also see it declining with the nation state. So both for theoretical and empirical reasons, I do believe that it is, in a relative sense, the best guarantor we have of the individual. But on points of particular policy, I completely agree about the viability.
I need to interject here at Ruminations. Your 5 minutes is up. Swithun Dobson, your 10-minute cross-examination of Ruminations begins now.
Oh, hi. Firstly, could you elaborate on what you mean, what your definition of the state is, please?
Okay, well, I think that for the purposes of this conversation, we'd have kind of two definitions. We'd have the historical definition of the nation state, which is basically the idea of a large body of citizens that are united on some principle of legal equality, say equality before the courts, the institution that arose in the late medieval period. So it's more of a phenomenon, I suppose, than a principle. But in a more abstract sense, and I apologize if I've at all been underhanded about having kind of two definitions, in a more abstract sense, the state would be any kind of coercive monopoly, such as would be institutionally in violation of the non-aggression principle.
Would prohibit my
Okay, hold on, Swithun, you're losing you again.
Sorry, internet. I can't help. So this state would prohibit my competing courts and security services.
No, not necessarily, because I believe that by the second definition, there was a kind of state apparatus that was present in medieval or private court system apparatus that was available in medieval England. So by the second definition, I suppose the state is compatible with private courts. I can imagine a scenario where in private courts could arise, or private security could arise competitively in the context of the state. Now, whether I'm advocating that is another question, but it is possible, provided that it's done so within some kind of common legal matrix, which can serve as a bulwark against other states and retains enough of the legal commonality so as to be conducive to the individual.
Okay, so what I'm trying to think is, of the three essential aspects of anarcho-capitalism that are outlined, which of those three are essentially against the state as you understand the state? Is it the lack of taxation, or the free competing courts and security services?
Well, I don't think that it's necessarily either of those so much as it is the presence of some kind of coercive body, which may not have an essential definition so much as a kind of phenomenological definition or observation of the state as something that occurs. You might say that some kind of coercive military presence, some kind of common standard of law over a broad geographical span.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so my idea, so the way I outlined how anarcho-capitalism could work would be having a certain law code, which is, say, promulgated by, I think most likely some form of legitimized religious institutions, of having sort of an overall legal code. Would you say it's that code as such which is the coercive aspect? Because it applies to everybody within this particular geographical area.
It could, but I almost support a certain degree of bureaucracy or of, you might say, inorganic commonality associated with some kind of institutional body, such as to depersonalize the nature of this code so that it is not simply a default on the prejudices of this or that given patriarch and can form, yeah. So that there is a difference than simply, I'm not simply identifying the state as a given executor or of a private property society.
Well, no, because so if you had sort of like some religious institution which would code it, and it was sort of considered sort of semi-divine, or at least recognizing the laws of God and was above sort of an individual patron or whatever, would that then constitute something like what you're saying the state is?
It could constitute something insofar as it, I mean, I think it might have to somehow claim some sort of monopoly on coercion with respect to a certain commons. That might be, the commons might be a good point of definition for the state.
Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, I mean, some common area in which, say, speech is enforced, or a freedom of speech is enforced or enforced against. Some place where it's said, this does not necessarily belong to anyone.
Oh, okay. I think the way I've articulated anarcho-capitalism, I don't think there's anything in principle why that's objectionable. I mean, it is objectionable from certain Rothbardian approaches, but I think with my more general view of it, I think in principle, whether certain forms of that would be good or not, I don't necessarily think that that's 100% contrary to my general position. But to a different question, we can maybe go over that a little bit more later. Mm-hmm. You state that individualism the state created a certain form of individualism away from allegiance to a particular house, etc., and had a greater sort of more abstract allegiance to something greater than a smaller body of people, which then liberated them. I think that's probably true to some extent, although whether that individualism is a good thing is another question. But how would you respond to say that there was sort of individualism as such, say, in pre-Norman England or say ancient Iceland or Ireland? How would you, because that's pre the state as we generally understand it, and would you say those societies had various levels of individualism? And if not, was it different, or to what extent was it different from the rise of the modern state and individualism since, say, the 16th century?
Well, this is why I pointed out the two definitions of the state. One is the nation state and one is the state in general. What I would argue is that these societies you're referring to would have been a more severe iteration of a certain type of state, in that we know that they were not particularly pleasant places to live. We know that they had certain coercive, intimately coercive traditions and so forth. And so this would be an example of a tolerable state displacing what is probably a less formal iteration of the state as it exists in the absence of modern nation states. So I believe that the medieval era did have a state, but that the replacement of this state by one definition by a more formalized liberal nation state was a desirable development. But I don't accept the premise of the question, and that I don't really accept that those societies were individualistic.
Oh, no, that's what I was asking. Would you say they were individualistic? That was the point. Were they?
Yeah, no, I would say not, because I would say that in a more fundamental way, they were the more severe iteration of the state that I'm speaking against, even if the state just meant this family, or even if the state just meant this tradition or this community. You get the picture.
Okay. Why do retaliatory tariffs help the anarcho-capitalist society?
Oh, well, I'm not saying that the institution of tariffs in this sense would be a good thing, but rather that as any kind of, in the spirit of pursuit of the non-aggression principle, that one would have to admit their legality or possibility as a retaliationary measure. And since they're not seemingly willing to do this, I think that their necessity, their prohibition by anarcho-capitalist philosophy is at cross purposes with any kind of consistent application of the non-aggression principle.
But that assumes that it's actually going to be of any help to them. I just don't see why it would be, because it'll just make goods more expensive for both producers and consumers in the ANCAP society.
Oh, well, you're assuming that I'm actually practically advocating tariffs. I'm rather advocating the admissibility of them on a kind of abstract a priori level. Whether or not tariffs are a good idea at a specific point in time is.
I need to intervene here. The 10 minutes for Swithun is up. Your 10 minutes of cross-examination begins right ruminations. Feel free to continue the thought if you wish.
Okay, yes, I'll just briefly conclude that thought in saying that I think that my advocacy of tariffs was one in principle, not addressing the question of whether a posteriori tariffs are actually conducive to a desirable result. But we'll move on to the question of, do you see a society that, say, was a minarchist society with voluntary taxation, such as the Randians support? Would such a society ever be possibly in keeping with the non-aggression principle? Could you have is the NAP ever compatible with the state?
No. I dislike using the term non-aggression principle because it's really an outgrowth of property theory more than anything else, and that's just merely an application of it. Voluntary taxation is a bit of an oxymoron. If you mean by that voluntary payments to a monopoly organization,
yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah. Well, that's possible, but if this monopoly organization were to prohibit entry of other courts or security agencies within their geographical area, and by this I mean not necessarily ones who follow different law codes, etc. This is just, well, we do what they do but better based on the same sort of legal principles, then that monopoly itself would be inadmissible, because it's preventing people from using their property in the way they see fit without directly aggressing against anybody else.
Okay, my argument, not that I'm necessarily meaning to advocate the non-aggression principle, but rather to advocate its approximate compatibility with the state. I would say that the reason that this this donation, as it were, to the system of donations to some kind of monopoly with respect to courts and policing and that kind of thing, is that I think that such institutions could be seen to presume a scenario where force has already been used and needs to be addressed. And so in that sense, these things don't really exist. These security, the courts, security, police, things of that nature might be seen to exist, could be justified monopolistically in keeping with the non-aggression principle, in that they are not existing in the realm of free transactions, but they're kind of existing in the realm of things as they are dealt with once some coercive action has already been taken. And therefore, I suppose they are sort of extra civilizational or extra commercial, as it were. What do you think? What would you say to that?
So if I understand what you say correctly, they are different from sort of market institutions insofar as they are merely retaliatory and so engage in that's the right word, aggressive behavior, which is sort of non-market activity in response to prior aggressive behavior. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's correct. And I would just briefly add that it's also kind of necessary to decide who is allowed to behave aggressively. That is, to kind of establish within which parameters is aggression, non-coercive aggression.
No, I would agree with that. I just don't see why you require a single body to do it. Which is why I've plugged the claim that if you have general agreed legal norms, etc., then this is perfectly compatible with multiple organizations enforcing them, and they would have the legitimacy to do so, because they are just following what are the prescribed, generally agreed upon norms in those situations.
But you see that what I'm getting at here is regardless of which arrangement you would prefer, you would at least hypothetically admit then that this kind of monopolistic practice is not incompatible with the non-aggression principle per se, if one formulates this understanding of it.
I just would not use the term monopolistic. I would say there is perfectly consistent to have violent retaliation against certain people for particular acts, and this could be, and that's perfectly legitimate. Yes. Okay.
An additional scenario I would like to put to you as to why anarcho-capitalism as a system may not be entirely feasible is first just a point of clarification, and I'd prefer to skip by this fairly quickly. Would you say that, at least in terms of behavior, the anarcho-capitalism is kind of like the acting out of systematically of the non-aggression principle, whether one believes it morally or not? It's an application of the non-aggression principle.
It could be. And it would be to a large extent in the Rothbardian sense of property theory. But as I said, I think there could be some variance around there. But broadly speaking, I think that would be fair.
Okay, now what I will put to you is a kind of a judge's dilemma scenario. Let's say you have let's say for the sake of argument that prostitution is immoral. Okay, and somebody affects signs a contract, basically guaranteeing that they will perform acts which amount to prostitution. And you have a judge who knows the illicitness, morally speaking, of prostitution. Is he required to enforce that contract? And by that, careful to mean, I understand that you might make the argument, well, what he should do is simply say, if you don't commit the act, you'll have to be punished. You should have thought of that before you signed the contract. But if he's really in keeping with his role as a judge in a genuine free society, private property society, it really is the judge's duty to command the act of prostitution. How should he respond to that? Should the society systematically, how should the society on a systemic level address that dilemma?
That's a much broader question than the strict ANCAP position that I'm articulating. Seem to argue whether specific performance contract is.
Yeah, we're losing you again, Swithun.
You could just buy yourself out of doing that. You could also, it would depend on whether the society held that while prostitution was immoral, that it should also be illegal, or whether it should be otherwise. There's a whole host. So whilst I said it is broadly in keeping with the Rothbardian property theory sort of non-aggression principle, I do think the way I've outlined it can allow for a reasonable amount of variety in particular legal codes, while still being in keeping with the three aspects that I use to define anarcho-capitalism to begin with.
Okay, well, what comes to mind here is that what I would say is that if you admit some kind of systemic, if you have a situation where the judge actually, the person is saying, no, you must, I'm not going to accept restitution. I am going to insist that you live up to this contract. A society that doesn't require the judge to per se command the act is by definition not anarcho-capitalist, because it's no longer really in keeping with the full mechanism of private property enforcement.
Okay, yes, I suppose you could make that case. But as I say, my point with respect to property was that it was a general first principle, and it would prevent systematic taxation. But I don't see why you couldn't have certain prohibitions on particular acts with your property whilst not expropriating it. So given my sort of, how should we say, lax understanding of anarcho-capitalism, I don't necessarily see something like that as a problem.
10 minutes cross-examination for Ruminations is up. Your 5-minute concluding remarks, Swithun Dobson, begin now.
Okay, so to continue with that, at least in the way in which I articulated anarcho-capitalism, there is no necessary reason that it has to follow a strict interpretation of Rothbardian property theory. Competing courts and competing security agencies would be able to do so in multiplicity of jurisdictions with different legal codes. The only thing I would add is that in my understanding of a broad anarcho-capitalist society, it just prohibits taxation as opposed to any other potential restrictions. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating all restrictions of that, but that a society which, absent taxation, could and still be consistent with my definition, have other restrictions on property usage or use of your own body, an example of prostitution. So I don't see any substantial arguments to why anarcho-capitalism can't work. And I don't also see why no, I didn't mention it before, but I don't necessarily see why individualism as such is necessarily coterminous with the pursuit of truth as such. I don't necessarily see individualism in the sense that at least the philosophical concepts of man as an atomized individual in the state of nature from Hobbes, etc., onwards, is necessarily a desirable way of looking at humanity. So in that respect, I suppose RR's criticism of the ANCAPs of sort of going back to sort of like a pre-state medieval system, I think is to some extent correct. But I don't necessarily see that as undesirable. And I don't see why a system which is similar but not identical to societies such as ancient Iceland, Ireland, or pre-Norman England would necessarily prohibit the individual's pursuit of truth, or the collective pursuit of truth for that matter, as well. With individualism and the philosophy of that, I mean, I suppose you end up with an act insofar as there isn't really any truth as such. It's just everything. So that lead truth as such, I think, is inaccurate on that basis. So I think my arguments as to why the ANCAP society would be superior to a state stand, and I think it is an ideal to which we should aspire.
All right. Thank you, Swithun. Your 5-minute concluding remarks, right? Ruminations, begin now.
Okay. Well, I will reiterate my position that politics is the discussion of the state as such. I do not believe that while it might be conceivable that it is in any way tenable that we can imagine a time without the state, there's a large world out there, and I think that the state will always dwarf any efforts at the establishment of any kind of anarcho-capitalist configuration going forward. And for this reason, the state is necessary to defend citizens against other states. I think that some kind of coercive body has always existed, and I think it likely always will exist. And I think that with respect to the nation state in particular, It's the only system that has been shown to be commensurate with the rise of what you might call the open-ended pursuit of truth, which is different than the pursuit of truth as it might have existed in the medieval era or in ancient Greece or any of these societies, in that it is at least nominally in keeping with some kind of rise of freedom of speech in the common era. That is freedom of speech as some kind of legal construct that does not just exist by accident of happening to have stumbled on someone's property where they permit relatively freedom of speech, free speech. I think that a good rule of thumb when it comes to free speech, free flow of ideas, the kind of indifferent appraisal of all ideas in a courtly manner, is one that is very difficult to attain, and it requires a very delicate arrangement of circumstances. And generally, you should probably only hope for it when at least the people advocating it are in favor, say they're in favor of freedom of speech. But when I have people like Stefan Kinsella, for example, saying that freedom of speech doesn't really exist as a separate right, it simply exists as a byproduct of property rights. When I hear Swithun say that it doesn't exist, or that freedom that the pursuit of truth is not necessarily part of a process of atomization, which basically means civilizational individualism. When I hear Hoppe say the things that he has said dismissively about freedom of speech, and advocate restrictions which are indeed stronger than the ones under which we're currently suffering, and more stark, as it were, I would say that there's no indication that this particular body of thought is directing itself towards the improvement of individualism or the furthering of that particular direction of thought. My final thing to say would be that that the kind of society that we have enjoyed and that we're afraid of losing rose with the nation state in the early modern period, and now that the nation state is threatening to collapse, those freedoms are once again beginning to erode. And I will end my closing statement there.
All right. This was the debate: is anarcho-capitalism an ideal to which we should aspire? Thanks again for Swithun Dobson and Ruminations for appearing in this discussion. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing off.